In the frozen depths of winter, when castles became prisons of stone and ice, the most dangerous place wasn't the battlefield or the dungeon. It was the room everyone needed, but no one wanted to discuss. Hello, dear traveler. As the evening settles around you and the world grows quiet, let me take you back to a time when winter meant something far more treacherous than we can imagine today. Settle yourself comfortably, breathe deeply, and let your mind wander backward through the centuries to a world of stone and ice, where even the simplest necessities of life held hidden dangers. In the bitter winter of 1348, in the northern reaches of England, where the wind came howling down from Scotland like a wolf seeking prey, there stood a castle called Thornwick. It wasn't one of the grand fortresses that would make its way into history books, nor was it a crumbling ruin that would be forgotten entirely. Thornwick was something in between, a respectable holding of moderate size, with walls thick enough to withstand a siege, but not so imposing as to invite one. Its lord was a minor baron, and its people were the sort who lived their lives in the long shadow between the great and the forgotten. Among these people was a man named Thomas Carpenter, and though his surname told you his trade, it didn't begin to tell you his story. Thomas was 34 years old in that winter of 1348, though he looked both younger and older depending on the light. When he smiled, which he still did despite everything life had thrown at him, the years fell away and you could see the boy he'd been, gap-toothed and eager, always ready with a joke or a clever observation. But when he was tired, when the weight of responsibility pressed down on his shoulders like a physical thing, he looked like a man of 50, with lines carved deep around his eyes and mouth. He had the hands of his profession, broad and capable, scarred in 100 places from slips of the chisel and catches of the saw. His fingers were long and surprisingly elegant for a man who worked with wood, and there was a delicacy to the way he touched things that spoke of an artist's soul trapped in a tradesman's life. Not that Thomas would have put it that way. He would have said simply that he liked his work, that there was satisfaction in taking a rough piece of oak or ash and transforming it into something useful, something that would last beyond his own brief span of years. Thomas lived in a small house built against the inner curtain wall of the castle, one of a row of similar dwellings that housed the craftsmen and servants who kept Thornwick running. The house had 2 rooms, a main room where the family cooked, ate, worked, and entertained what few guests they had, and a smaller room where they slept. In winter, they heated only the main room, letting the fire in the central hearth do what it could against the cold that seeped through every crack and gap in the wattle and daub walls. The sleeping room became so cold that frost formed on the inside of the shutters, creating patterns like ferns that would have been beautiful if they hadn't been a reminder of how thin the barrier was between shelter and the killing cold outside. He shared this house with his wife Eleanor and their 3 children. Eleanor was a year younger than Thomas, a woman of medium height with dark hair that she kept covered as respectability demanded and eyes that missed nothing. She had been pretty once, and still was when you caught her in the right moment, but years of hard work and harder winters had worn away the softness that youth provides. She was the daughter of the castle's master baker, and she had brought to her marriage not only a small dowry, but also a network of connections within the castle hierarchy that had proven far more valuable than any amount of silver. Their eldest child was Margaret, who was 12 years old and already showing signs of becoming a beauty like her mother had been. She had Eleanor's dark hair and Thomas's easy smile, and a quick mind that sometimes worried her parents. She was clever enough to notice things that children weren't supposed to notice, to ask questions that had no easy answers. She helped her mother with the cooking and cleaning and minding of her younger siblings, but Thomas had also taught her some of the simpler aspects of his trade. She could sand a piece of wood smooth as silk, and she had an eye for finding the grain that would make a finished piece most beautiful. The middle child was John, who was 9 and as different from his sister as night from day. Where Margaret was thoughtful and observant, John was action and energy barely contained in a small body. He was always running, always climbing, always getting into some scrape or another. He had his father's love of making things but not his patience, and Thomas despaired of ever teaching the boy the fine work that was the difference between a carpenter and a mere woodworker. But John had a good heart, quick to share whatever he had and quick to defend those smaller or weaker than himself, which meant he often came home with bruises from fights he'd started on someone else's behalf. The youngest was Catherine, just 4 years old, with blonde hair that neither parent could account for, though Thomas's mother had been fair before age turned her hair gray, so perhaps it came from there. Catherine was the joy of the household, still young enough to believe that the world was fundamentally good and that adults could fix anything. She had a laugh like bells, and even in the darkest part of winter, she could somehow find reasons to be delighted. She loved to sit with her father while he worked, asking endless questions about what he was doing and why, and Thomas never had the heart to send her away even when her chatter made concentration difficult. This was Thomas's world in the winter of 1348, small, bounded by the castle walls and the limits of his craft, but full nonetheless. He woke before dawn to the sound of the castle coming to life around him, the clatter of the kitchen servants starting their work, the bells calling the religious to prayer, the stamp and snort of horses in the stables. He broke his fast with whatever Eleanor provided, usually bread from her father's ovens, sometimes with a bit of cheese or a heel of bacon if they'd been fortunate, and then made his way to his workshop. The workshop was attached to the castle's main keep, a privilege that spoke to Thomas's skill and his father-in-law's influence. It was a good space, well lit by large windows that could be shuttered against the wind, with a proper wooden floor and racks along the walls for his tools and his timber. In summer it was pleasant, with breezes carrying away the sawdust and the smell of fresh-cut wood. In winter it was still cold enough that his breath plumed white and his fingers grew stiff, but it was warmer than working outside would have been, and for that Thomas was grateful. His work varied with the seasons and the needs of the castle. In summer he might be called upon to repair the lord's furniture or to build new pieces, a carved chair for the great hall perhaps, or a chest for milady's chamber. He made doors and shutters, bowls and plates, handles for tools and weapons. In winter, when outdoor work was impossible, he focused on the finer pieces, the ones that required patience and precision. He was working on a set of carved panels for the castle's chapel, scenes from the lives of the saints that would be assembled into a screen separating the altar from the nave. It was the finest work he'd ever done, and he knew that it would be his legacy, the thing that people would remember about Thomas Carpenter long after he was dead. But on this particular December morning, cold and gray and filled with the promise of snow, Thomas was not working on the chapel screen. He was working on something far less glorious but far more urgent. He was repairing one of the castle's garderobes. The garderobe, even the word itself was a euphemism, a polite fiction. It meant wardrobe, a place where clothes were kept, but everyone knew what it really meant. It was the privy, the jakes, the necessary house, the place where the body's waste was disposed of. In Thornwick Castle, as in every castle of any size, there were several garderobes built into the thickness of the walls, small chambers that jutted out from the main structure with a simple bench seat, and a hole that dropped straight down to the moat or the midden heap below. The garderobe that needed Thomas's attention was one of the smaller ones, located on the second floor of the east tower. It served the chambers of the castle's lesser nobility, knights and ladies in waiting, the steward and the chaplain. It had been built 50 years earlier, when the tower was added to the original keep, and like everything built by men, it was succumbing to time and use. The wooden seat was cracked and splintering, and the door hung crooked on its hinges. Worse, the frame around the door was rotting where water had seeped in through gaps in the stonework, and the cold had gotten into the wood and made it crack and crumble. Thomas had inspected the garderobe 3 days earlier, when the steward had summoned him to look at it. The steward was a man named Geoffrey, thin and precise, who took his responsibilities seriously and expected everyone else to do the same. He had shown Thomas the damage with a look of profound distaste on his long face, as if the garderobe's disrepair was a personal insult. "It must be fixed before the Lord returns," Geoffrey had said. The Lord was away at court, attending on the king, and was expected back before Christmas. It would not do for Sir Edmund to find his household in such a state. Thomas had agreed, though privately he thought there were probably more important things to worry about than a cracked privy seat. But work was work, and he wasn't in a position to turn it down. He'd taken his measurements and made his notes, and promised to have it repaired within the week. Now, 3 days later, he was carrying his tools and his materials up the narrow spiral stairs of the East Tower. The stairs were worn smooth by generations of feet, and they were treacherous in the weak winter light that filtered through the arrow slits. Thomas climbed carefully, his arms full of wood and his tool bag slung over his shoulder. Behind him came his apprentice, a boy named Will who was 14 and still growing into his oversized hands and feet. Will was a good lad, earnest and hardworking, though not particularly bright. He had been apprenticed to Thomas 2 years earlier, the son of one of the castle's men-at-arms, and he applied himself to the work with determination, if not natural talent. He would never be a master craftsman, Thomas thought, but he would be a competent carpenter, and that was worth something. The world needed more competent workmen than it needed artists. They reached the second floor and made their way along the corridor to the garderobe. The castle was quiet at this hour, most of the household at their morning tasks, and their footsteps echoed off the stone walls. Thomas set down his burden outside the garderobe door and pushed it open. The smell hit him immediately, not overwhelming but present, the unavoidable consequence of the room's purpose. The garderobe was small, barely large enough for one person to stand, with the wooden seat taking up most of the space. A narrow window high in the wall provided ventilation and a bit of light, though in winter the shutters were usually closed against the cold. Thomas examined the seat more closely now, running his hands over the cracked wood, feeling where it had warped and split. It would need to be replaced entirely, he decided. Repairs would only last a season or two, and then he'd be back here doing the same work again. Better to do it properly now. He'd brought oak for the purpose, good solid wood that would last for decades if properly treated. "Will," he said, "fetch me the pry bar. We'll need to remove this whole assembly." The boy rummaged in the tool bag and produced the bar, a length of iron with a flattened, curved end. Thomas wedged it under the edge of the seat and began to work it loose. The old nails groaned and squeaked as he pried them free, and the wood cracked further as he levered it up. It was slower work than he'd anticipated. The seat had been secured very thoroughly when it was first installed, and time had only made the nails more stubborn. As he worked, Thomas's mind wandered to other things. He thought about the chapel screen and the panel he'd been carving, St. Catherine with her wheel. He thought about Margaret and whether it was time to start looking for an apprenticeship for her, though what craft would take a girl he didn't know. He thought about Elena and the way she'd been coughing lately, a dry, persistent cough that worried him more than he wanted to admit. He thought about the coming winter and whether they had enough firewood laid by, enough food stored away. He didn't think about the hole beneath the seat or what might be down there in the darkness. He should have. That was the thing that would haunt him later, that he should have been more careful, more thoughtful, more aware of the danger. But how could he have known? How could anyone have known? The seat came loose with a final crack and a shower of splinters. Thomas lifted it away and set it aside, then bent down to examine the opening. It was about a foot across, roughly circular, dropping straight down through the thickness of the wall and the floor below to empty into the castle moat. He couldn't see the bottom. It was too dark and too far down. But he could hear water moving sluggishly far below and smell the sharp tang of waste and decay. "Hand me that lamp," he told Will. The boy passed him a small oil lamp they'd brought for working in the dim space. Thomas held it over the opening, trying to get a better look at the condition of the stonework. The walls of the shaft were slick with moisture and other things he didn't care to think about too closely. He could see places where the mortar had crumbled away, where the stones had shifted. It was worse than he'd thought. This wasn't just a matter of replacing the wooden seat. The whole structure needed work. He straightened up, shaking his head. "We'll need to report this to Jeffrey," he said. "This is going to take more than a day's work. The shaft itself is deteriorating. It should be relined, or at least the mortar should be replaced where it's failed." Will nodded, though Thomas wasn't sure how much the boy understood about the work involved. "Should I go fetch him now, master?" "Not yet. Let's get this seat rebuilt first, and then we'll show him the problem. No sense bothering him twice." They worked steadily through the morning, Thomas measuring and cutting and fitting the new seat while Will handed him tools and held pieces in place. It was familiar work, comfortable in its way, requiring attention but not deep concentration. They talked a bit as they worked, or rather Will talked while Thomas made encouraging noises. The boy was worried about his father, who was supposed to be riding patrol along the Scottish border, but hadn't been heard from in 2 weeks. Thomas reassured him that no news was probably good news, that if something had happened to the patrol, they would have heard about it by now. The light from the narrow window shifted as the sun moved across the sky. Thomas's fingers grew cold despite the work, and he had to stop occasionally to blow on them and flex them back to life. The castle around them came fully awake, voices echoing in the corridors, footsteps on the stairs, the distant clatter of the kitchen. Someone was roasting meat, and the smell made Thomas's stomach growl. He'd had only bread for breakfast hours ago. By midday, the new seat was in place, solid and smooth, fitted snugly to the stonework. Thomas ran his hands over it one last time, checking for rough spots, then nodded in satisfaction. "Good work," he told Will, and the boy beamed. "Now let's go find Jeffrey and show him what needs to be done about the shaft." They found the steward in the great hall, overseeing the servants as they set up the trestle tables for the midday meal. He listened to Thomas's report with his usual expression of patient disapproval, as if the deteriorating garderobe was yet another example of the universe's failure to meet his standards. "How long will it take to make the repairs properly?" he asked. Thomas considered. "To do it right, 3 days, maybe 4. We'll need to build a scaffold inside the shaft so I can work on the stonework. And we'll need lime for mortar, which means a trip to the storehouses." 3 days, Jeffrey cut him off. "That's unacceptable. Sir Edmund returns in 10 days, and I have a dozen other matters that need attention before then. Can you make it safe? Make it functional?" "Well, yes, but..." "Then do that. The more extensive repairs can wait until spring." Jeffrey was already turning away, dismissing them. "And make sure you clean up after yourselves. I don't want debris left lying about." Thomas opened his mouth to argue, then closed it again. There was no point. Jeffrey had made his decision, and Thomas was in no position to overrule him. He nodded and led Will back toward the stairs. "Is that wise, master?" Will asked quietly. "If the stonework fails." "I know," Thomas said. He felt uneasy about it himself, but what could he do? He was a carpenter, not a mason, and in any case he couldn't refuse to follow the steward's orders. We'll shore it up as best we can. Put in some good strong bracing, so even if the stones shift, the opening stays secure. It's not ideal, but it should hold. It should hold. Those words would echo in his mind later, but at that moment they seemed reasonable enough. The castle had stood for over a century. The guardrobes had been in use for 50 years. A bit of deteriorating mortar wasn't going to bring it all crashing down overnight. Or so he told himself. They spent the afternoon working on the bracing, cutting and fitting pieces of oak to reinforce the opening. It was delicate work, because the space was so confined, and because Thomas wanted to make sure the bracing would actually support weight if the stonework failed. He cut notches into the stone where he could, wedging the wood tight, and used iron brackets where the stone was too sound to cut. Gradually, a framework took shape, encircling the opening, distributing any load across multiple points. The light was beginning to fail when they finished. Thomas stood back and examined his work, trying to see it with fresh eyes. It looked solid enough. The wood was good oak, properly seasoned, and the joints were tight. If the stonework around the shaft did start to fail, this framework should catch it and hold it, at least long enough for proper repairs to be made. It would have to do. Clean up the tools, he told Will. I'm going to show Jeffrey what we've done. But Jeffrey was nowhere to be found, and after asking around, Thomas learned that the steward had gone to the village on some errand and wouldn't be back until evening. Thomas shrugged and decided it could wait until morning. The work was done, after all. What did it matter if the steward saw it today or tomorrow? He made his way home through the darkening castle, his body tired in the pleasant way that came from a day of good work well done. The smell of cooking was stronger now, coming from every dwelling, and his stomach reminded him that he hadn't eaten since morning. As he walked, he thought about what Alina might have prepared for dinner, hoped it might be the bean pottage she made so well, thick and savory with bits of bacon. The house was warm when he pushed open the door, heat rolling out to meet him along with the smells of food and home. The children were already at the table, Margaret helping Catherine with her eating while John fidgeted and reached for the bread. Alina looked up from the pot she was stirring and smiled at him, and something in Thomas's chest loosened at the sight of her. "Good day?" she asked. "Good enough," he said, and bent to kiss her cheek before washing his hands in the basin by the door. They ate together, the family squeezed around the small table, talking about their days. Margaret had helped her grandfather in the bakehouse and learned a new way to braid bread dough. John had been in trouble for climbing on the stable roof, but swore he'd only been trying to rescue a cat that had gotten stuck there. Catherine wanted to know if her father had seen any dragons in the castle, and was disappointed when he said he hadn't. Alina had been to the market and had interesting gossip about the merchant's wife and the blacksmith's son, though she wouldn't share the details with the children present. It was ordinary, it was comfortable. It was the kind of evening that Thomas had experienced 1,000 times before and hoped to experience 1,000 times more. There was nothing to suggest that it was the last ordinary evening they would have for a very long time. After the meal, Thomas sat by the fire and worked on a small carving while Eleanor put the children to bed. It was a simple thing, a small horse he was making for Catherine, but he enjoyed the detail work, the way the wood seemed to come alive under his hands. He could hear Eleanor in the other room, her voice soft as she told the children a story, and later her footsteps as she moved between the beds, tucking them in, kissing them good night. When she came back to the main room, she sat down beside him and picked up her own work, mending one of John's tunics. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the only sounds the crackle of the fire and the soft scrape of Thomas's knife against wood. "You're worried about something," Eleanor said eventually. Thomas looked up, surprised. "What makes you say that?" "You get a line right here." She touched the spot between her eyebrows. "When you're worried. And you've been quiet all evening." He smiled despite himself. After 12 years of marriage, she could still read him like one of the priest's books. "It's nothing really. Just a job I did today, the garderobe in the East Tower. The shaft is in worse shape than I thought, and Jeffrey won't authorize proper repairs until spring." "Is it dangerous?" "No," he said quickly. Then more honestly, "Probably not. I've braced it as well as I can. It should hold." "Should," Eleanor repeated, catching the same word Will had caught. She looked at him steadily. "But you're not certain." "I'm as certain as I can be without rebuilding the whole thing." He set down his carving and rubbed his eyes. "The truth is, the stonework is deteriorating and should be properly repaired. But Jeffrey says it can wait, and he's the steward. What am I supposed to do?" Eleanor was quiet for a moment, her needle moving in and out of the fabric. "You're supposed to keep people safe," she said finally. "That's what your work is for, isn't it? To build things that last, that protect people." "I know." He felt the weight of it, the responsibility. "I've done what I can. The bracing will hold. And maybe in spring they'll authorize the full repairs." She nodded, but he could see she wasn't entirely satisfied with his answer. Neither was he, truth be told, but what more could he do? He was a carpenter, not a lord. He followed orders, did his work, and hoped for the best. That was the way of things. They sat together a while longer, then banked the fire and went to bed. The sleeping room was cold enough that their breath misted, and they huddled together under the wool blankets for warmth. Thomas listened to Eleanor's breathing slow and deepen as she fell asleep, and tried to quiet his own mind enough to follow her. But sleep was elusive. He found himself thinking about the garderobe, about the crumbling mortar and the dark shaft dropping away into nothing. He thought about the framework he'd built, wondered if it would really be enough. He thought about Jeffrey's dismissive response, about the pressure to work quickly and cheaply rather than well. He thought about all the garderobes in the castle, all the shafts and openings and holes built into the walls, and wondered how many of them were in similar disrepair. Eventually he did sleep, but his dreams were uneasy, full of falling and darkness, and the sound of stone grinding against stone. He woke before dawn as always, rose and dressed in the dark, careful not to wake a leaner. He broke his fast with bread and weak ale, then made his way through the silent castle to his workshop. He planned to spend the day working on the chapel screen, getting back to the carving of Saint Catherine that he'd been working on before the garderobe repair interrupted him. But he never got the chance. He'd barely settled into his work when Jeffrey appeared in the doorway of the workshop, his face even more pinched and disapproving than usual. "Thomas," he said without preamble, "I need you at the East Tower." "Immediately." Something in his tone made Thomas's stomach clench. He set down his tools and followed the steward without asking questions. They moved quickly through the castle, their footsteps echoing off the stone. Other people were moving as well, servants and men-at-arms, all heading in the same direction, all with the same tense, urgent manner. As they climbed the stairs of the East Tower, Thomas could hear voices above, shouting, and smell something that made his throat close with dread. It was the smell of sewage, thick and overwhelming, mixed with something else, something wrong. They emerged onto the second floor, and Thomas saw immediately what had happened. The door to the garderobe stood open, and water was spreading across the corridor floor, dark and foul-smelling. But it wasn't just water. Mixed with it were other things, solid waste and debris, and the smell was so strong it made his eyes water. "The shaft is backed up," Jeffrey said tightly. "Everything is flowing back out through the opening. We need to clear it immediately before it damages the whole floor." Thomas pushed past him into the garderobe and stopped dead. The new seat he'd installed just yesterday was awash with filthy water, rising up through the hole, spilling over onto the floor. Even as he watched, another surge came through, bringing with it a fresh wave of stench. The framework he'd built was intact. He could see that immediately, but something had blocked the shaft below, causing everything to back up. "We need to clear the blockage," he said, speaking quickly, trying to think. "Send someone down to the base of the shaft, to the moat. Whatever's blocking it must be near the bottom." Jeffrey was already shouting orders to the men-at-arms who had gathered in the corridor. Two of them went running down the stairs. Thomas turned back to the garderobe, trying to assess the situation. The water was still rising, which meant the blockage was complete. If they didn't clear it soon, the damage would be extensive. He spent the next hour in a nightmare of filth and stench, working with Will and several servants to try to contain the overflow. They brought rags and buckets, built a barrier of sandbags across the doorway to keep the worst of it from spreading further into the corridor. Thomas's new seat was completely submerged now, and he tried not to think about the irony. All that careful work yesterday, and now this. The men-at-arms returned with grim news. The base of the shaft was blocked by ice. The cold weather had frozen the moat, and the ice had built up around the opening until it was completely sealed. Everything that had gone down the shaft in the past day had nowhere to go but back up. "Break through the ice," Jeffrey ordered. "Use picks, axes, whatever you need." More men were dispatched. Thomas continued to work on containing the mess, his mind racing. This was worse than he'd thought. If the shaft could be blocked by ice, if the pressure could build up enough to force everything back up through the opening, then the whole structure was more vulnerable than anyone had realized. What if the ice had damaged the shaft itself? What if his bracing wasn't enough? It took most of the morning to break through the ice and clear the blockage. When they finally did, the backed-up sewage rushed out in a torrent, and slowly the level in the garderobe began to drop. By midday it was down to normal, and by afternoon they had cleaned up most of the mess in the corridor. Thomas stood in the garderobe, looking down at his ruined seat, and felt something like despair wash over him. All that work wasted. And worse, he knew now that this was a problem that wouldn't be solved by simply replacing wooden seats. The whole system was flawed, vulnerable to the very weather that made the garderobe most necessary. In winter, when people least wanted to make their way to an outdoor privy, the castle's garderobes were most likely to fail. Geoffrey found him there an hour later, still standing in the garderobe, staring at the hole as if it might offer up some solution. The steward's expression was grim, his usual mask of precise disapproval replaced by something closer to genuine worry. The Lord's chamber garderobe has the same problem, Geoffrey said without preamble. The shaft there is blocked as well, and starting to back up. And there are reports of similar issues in the West Tower. Thomas turned to look at him. It's the cold. The moat has frozen solid, and the ice is sealing the openings. Every garderobe that empties into the moat is going to have this problem until the weather warms. That could be months. Geoffrey's voice was flat. We cannot have the castle's garderobes unusable for months. Sir Edmund returns in 9 days. What am I to tell him? That his household cannot even manage its own waste. Thomas almost laughed at the absurdity of it, but swallowed it back. This was no laughing matter. We need to keep the openings clear of ice. Send men down every day to break through it before it can build up too thick. And we need to inspect every garderobe shaft in the castle, check the stonework, make sure nothing else is ready to fail. How long will that take? Days. A week, perhaps. These are old structures, Geoffrey. Some of them are 50 years old or more. They need maintenance, proper repairs, not just quick patches. The steward was silent for a long moment, his thin face drawn. Thomas could see him calculating, weighing the costs and the risks, the political implications of having a castle with failing sanitation when the Lord returned. Finally, he nodded. Do what needs to be done. Inspect every garderobe. Make a list of what requires repair. I'll present it to Sir Edmund when he returns, and let him make the decision about how to proceed. It was more than Thomas had expected, and he felt a small measure of relief. Thank you. I'll start immediately. One more thing. Geoffrey's voice dropped, became almost confidential. This situation, the backing up, the mess, it must be contained quietly. I don't want panic spreading through the household. The servants will gossip, of course, but do what you can to minimize the talk. The last thing we need is rumors that the castle itself is falling apart. Thomas nodded, understanding. Reputation was everything for a minor noble like Sir Edmund. If word spread that Thornwick couldn't even maintain its basic facilities, it would be humiliating. Worse, it might make people wonder what else was being neglected, what other problems were being hidden behind the castle's solid walls. He gathered will and explained what needed to be done. They would inspect every garderobe in the castle, starting with the ones in the main keep and working outward. They would examine the stonework, test the wooden structures, check for cracks and deterioration and signs of stress. It was unglamorous work, the kind that no one wanted to do, but it was necessary. They worked through the afternoon and into the evening, climbing stairs and squeezing into the narrow garderobe chambers, breathing through their mouths to minimize the smell. Thomas had brought a lantern and his tools, and at each garderobe he conducted a thorough examination. He tapped the stonework, listening for hollow sounds that might indicate crumbling mortar. He inspected the wooden seats for rot and weakness. He peered down the shafts as far as the lantern light would reach, looking for obvious problems. What he found was troubling. Nearly every garderobe showed some degree of deterioration. The wooden seats were generally sound. They were replaced often enough that they rarely had time to rot, but the stonework was another matter. Mortar had crumbled away in places, leaving gaps where cold air could penetrate. In one garderobe, a stone had actually shifted, creating a visible crack in the shaft wall. In another, water seepage had caused green slime to grow across the stones, making them slippery and treacherous. By the time darkness fell, Thomas had inspected 8 garderobes and found problems in 6 of them. He was exhausted, his back aching from bending and crouching in confined spaces, his nose burning from the constant assault of sewage smell. Will looked even worse, pale and sweating despite the cold, clearly fighting nausea. "Go home," Thomas told the boy. "Get some food, some rest. We'll continue tomorrow." Will didn't argue, just nodded gratefully and fled. Thomas gathered his tools more slowly, his mind heavy with what he'd found. The situation was worse than he'd imagined. The castle's garderobes weren't just suffering from isolated problems. They were systematically failing, all of them aging at once, all of them succumbing to years of use and weather and neglect. He made his way home through the dark castle, too tired even to feel hungry. Eleanor took one look at him and drew him to the fire without a word. She brought him hot water to wash with and warm ale to drink, and didn't ask questions when he was too weary to eat much dinner. The children, sensing his mood, were quieter than usual. Even Catherine's chatter was muted. That night he slept heavily, dreamlessly, the sleep of pure exhaustion. But he woke in the darkest hours of the night to the sound of shouting somewhere in the castle, distant but urgent. He lay still for a moment, hoping it was nothing, hoping he could ignore it and go back to sleep. But the shouting continued, and he heard running feet in the courtyard below. He rose and dressed quickly, careful not to wake Eleanor, though he saw her eyes open in the darkness. "It's probably nothing," he whispered. "Stay here." But he knew even as he said it, that it was something. You didn't shout like that for nothing. You didn't run through the castle in the middle of the night unless something had gone very wrong. He made his way toward the noise, following other figures who were emerging from their dwellings, all moving in the same direction, toward the east tower. Toward the garderobe he had just repaired. The corridor on the second floor was chaos. People crowded the narrow space, servants and men-at-arms, all talking at once, all pointing. Thomas pushed through them, his heart hammering until he reached the garderobe. The door hung from one hinge, twisted and broken. Inside, the new seat he had installed was gone, completely gone, and the opening in the floor was twice the size it should have been. Stones from the shaft had collapsed inward, taking the wooden framework with them, creating a ragged hole that dropped away into darkness. The smell that rose from it was overwhelming. And there was blood, not much but enough. Dark stains on the broken wood, on the stone edges of the enlarged opening. Jeffrey appeared at his elbow, his face colorless in the lantern light. One of the chambermaids. She came to use the garderobe in the night. The seat gave way beneath her, and she fell. Thomas felt the world tilt. He fell. How far? All the way. Down to the moat. Jeffrey's voice was barely audible. They've sent men to look for her, but he didn't finish. He didn't need to. If she had fallen the full height of the shaft, 2 stories down to frozen ground, there was no chance she had survived. Thomas moved closer to the opening, holding his lantern over it. He could see where the stonework had failed, where the mortar had given way and the stones had simply collapsed inward. His wooden framework had tried to hold. He could see the marks where the wood had been stressed, but the weight of the shifting stones had been too much. The whole thing had cascaded, stone pulling on stone, until the entire opening had given way. "I need to see the base of the shaft," he said. His voice sounded strange in his own ears, distant and mechanical. They went down together, Thomas and Jeffrey and several men-at-arms, carrying torches and lanterns. They made their way around the castle's exterior to where the east tower met the moat. The moat was indeed frozen solid, a fact that was hideously relevant now. If it had been summer, if there had been water below to break the fall, perhaps she might have had a chance. They found her at the base of the tower, among the rubble and waste that had accumulated there over decades. She was lying impossibly twisted, her body broken by the fall. Thomas knew her by sight. Her name was Alice. She was perhaps 16, the daughter of one of the village farmers. She had come to work at the castle only a few months earlier. She was still alive. It seemed impossible, but when they reached her they could see shallow breathing, could hear small sounds of pain. Her eyes were open but unfocused, and there was blood on her face, in her hair, soaking into her dress. One of her legs was bent at an angle that made Thomas turn away, fighting the urge to be sick. "Get the physician," Jeffrey snapped at one of the men-at-arms. Quickly. They waited in the cold and the dark while the man ran for help. Thomas knelt beside Alice, not knowing what to do, afraid to touch her in case he made things worse. She was shivering, and he took off his cloak and laid it over her, the only thing he could think to do. "On the seat," she whispered. Her voice was so faint he had to lean close to hear. "It broke. I felt it break, and then I was falling." "Don't try to talk," Thomas said. His hands were shaking. "Help is coming." The physician arrived, an elderly man named Brother Martin who served both as the castle's medical care and as chaplain. He took one look at Alice and his face went carefully blank, the expression of a man who had seen too much death to show his feelings anymore. He examined her briefly, gently, and then sat back on his heels. "There's nothing to be done," he said quietly. "Her back is broken, and God knows what internal injuries. Even if we could move her to the infirmary, which we cannot without killing her immediately, she would not survive the night." "You have to try," Thomas said. "There must be something." "There is nothing." Brother Martin's voice was not unkind, but it was final. "All I can do is ease her passing." He had brought his bag, and from it he took a small vial. He mixed something with water and helped Alice drink it, supporting her head with surprising tenderness. "For the pain," he explained. "She'll drift away now peacefully." They waited while the potion took effect. Alice's breathing slowed, and the lines of pain in her young face eased. Her eyes closed. After a time, Thomas didn't know how long, could never afterward remember, she simply stopped breathing. Brother Martin checked for a pulse, then gently closed her eyes and drew Thomas's cloak up to cover her face. "May God grant her peace," he said, and made the sign of the cross over her body. They carried her back into the castle on a makeshift stretcher, moving slowly and carefully even though it no longer mattered. Geoffrey sent for Alice's father, who would have to be told, who would have to come and identify her body and make arrangements for burial. Thomas followed behind the stretcher, his mind numb with shock and guilt. She had died because of his work. Because the framework he had built had not been strong enough, because the repairs he had made had not been adequate, because he had told Geoffrey it should hold, had assured everyone it was safe, and he had been wrong. The rest of the night passed in a blur. Thomas found himself in the great hall, answering questions from Geoffrey, from the captain of the guard, from other castle officials. What had happened? What had caused the collapse? Had he known the structure was unsafe? Why had he said it was secure if it wasn't? He tried to explain about the deteriorating stonework, about how he had braced it as best he could, about how Geoffrey had refused to authorize full repairs. But even as he said it, he knew it sounded like excuses. A girl was dead, nothing else mattered. Alice's father arrived near dawn, a broad-shouldered farmer named John, his face gray with shock. He identified his daughter's body, standing silent over her covered form in the castle's small chapel. Thomas watched from a distance, unable to look away even though every fiber of his being wanted to flee. John said nothing to him, didn't even seem to see him, but Thomas felt the weight of that silence like a physical blow. When the sun finally rose, bringing a cold gray light to the castle, Thomas made his way home. He found Eleanor awake, waiting for him, already knowing something terrible had happened from the way the castle had been stirring all night. He told her everything, his voice flat and exhausted, and when he was done, she held him while he shook with delayed reaction. "It wasn't your fault," she said firmly. "You did what you could with what you were given. Jeffrey wouldn't authorize proper repairs. You told me so yourself. I should have refused to do the work at all if I couldn't do it right. I should have insisted on full repairs or refused to certify it as safe. And then what? Jeffrey would have found someone else to do it, someone less skilled than you, and the same thing would have happened. Or worse." He wanted to believe her, but the guilt sat in his chest like a stone. Alice had been 16 years old. She had her whole life ahead of her, and now she was dead and her blood was on his hands. He didn't go to his workshop that day. He couldn't face it, couldn't face the chapel screen and St. Catherine and the beautiful things he made. What did any of it matter? What was the point of creating beauty when the fundamental structures of life, the simple, unglamorous necessities, were crumbling? But the next day, Jeffrey summoned him again. There was no accusation in the steward's manner, no blame. There was only grim necessity. The castle's garderobe still needed to be inspected. The problems still needed to be cataloged and addressed. Life and its necessities went on. "I know this is difficult," Jeffrey said, "but we cannot stop. If anything, this tragedy makes it more urgent that we identify and repair all the failing structures before someone else is hurt." Thomas nodded slowly. He understood the logic, even if his heart rebelled against it. "I'll need help. This is beyond what Will and I can do alone. Some of the repairs require masonry work, and all of them need to be done quickly. You'll have whatever resources you need." Jeffrey's voice was heavy. "Sir Edmund will hear about this before he returns. News travels too fast for it to be kept quiet. When he arrives, I want to be able to tell him that we've identified all the problems and are already working on solutions." So Thomas went back to work. He and Will resumed their inspection of the castle's garderobes, but now they were joined by two masons, an older man named Robert and his son Peter. Robert had been working on the castle's fortifications and knew stonework in a way Thomas never would. Together they examined each garderobe more thoroughly than before, Robert assessing the condition of the shafts while Thomas evaluated the wooden components. What they found was a castle literally crumbling from within. The garderobes were just the most visible symptoms of a deeper problem. Thornwick had been built a century ago, expanded and modified over the decades, and much of that work had been done quickly and cheaply. Corners had been cut, inferior materials used, drainage systems neglected. The winter's cold had simply exposed weaknesses that had been developing for years. The work was grimmer now, shadowed by Alice's death. They all felt it, the weight of responsibility, the knowledge that these weren't just academic assessments but matters of life and death. Thomas found himself being far more conservative in his judgments, erring always on the side of caution. If he had any doubt about a structure's safety, He marked it for immediate closure and repair. By the end of the third day, they had identified 17 garderobes that needed significant repairs. 7 of those were deemed unsafe for any use and were closed immediately, forcing the castle's residents to make other arrangements. It was inconvenient and embarrassing, but no one argued. Alice's death had made everyone acutely aware of the dangers. Geoffrey presented their findings to the castle's council, the senior household officials who managed Thornwick's day-to-day operations. Thomas was called to attend, to explain what they had found and what needed to be done. He stood before them in the small council chamber, still in his work clothes, smelling of sweat and stone dust, and described the situation as clearly as he could. "The fundamental problem," he said, "is that these structures are old and have not been properly maintained. The cold weather has made things worse, freezing the moat and causing ice to build up around the openings, but the underlying deterioration would have caused failures eventually regardless. We need comprehensive repairs, new stonework where the mortar has failed, replacement of damaged beams and seats, improved drainage to prevent water accumulation." "How much will this cost?" asked the chamberlain, a perpetually worried man named Hugh who managed the castle's finances. Robert the mason answered that one. £15, perhaps 20. The stonework alone will require significant materials and labor, and some of the shafts may need to be completely rebuilt. There was silence around the table. £15 was a substantial sum, more than the castle spent in a normal year on maintenance and repairs combined. "Sir Edmund will have to decide," Geoffrey said finally. "We can present the situation to him when he returns, along with your recommendations. In the meantime, continue with the most urgent repairs, anything that poses an immediate safety risk." Thomas and his expanded crew worked through the following days in a race against time. They needed to make as much progress as possible before Sir Edmund returned, both to show that the situation was being addressed and to minimize the disruption to the household. It meant long days and sometimes working into the night by lamplight, but no one complained. The memory of Alice's broken body was too fresh. Thomas found himself thinking about her often as he worked. He hadn't known her well. She was just one of many servants who passed through the castle, faces he saw occasionally but never really noticed. Now he wished he had paid more attention, had learned something about her beyond her name. Did she have siblings? What had brought her from her father's farm to work in the castle? What had she dreamed about for her future? He would never know the answers to those questions, and that seemed like another tragedy piled on top of the first. Elinor noticed his dark mood, of course. She always noticed. One evening when the children were asleep, she sat beside him and took his hand. "You're carrying this like a burden," she said gently. "But you're not responsible for every stone in this castle, Thomas. You're not responsible for decisions made decades ago, or for Geoffrey's refusal to authorize proper repairs, or for the weather. You did your best with what you had. My best wasn't good enough." No one's best is always good enough. That's part of being human. We do what we can, and sometimes it's not enough, and we have to live with that. He knew she was right intellectually. But knowing and feeling were different things. The guilt remained, a constant ache like an old injury that never quite healed. Sir Edmund returned to Thornwick on a cold, clear day, exactly when he was expected. Thomas watched from his workshop window as the Lord's party rode through the castle gates. A dozen men on horseback, the Lord himself distinguished by his fine cloak and the deference everyone showed him. Sir Edmund was a man in his middle years, with the weathered look of someone who spent much time outdoors and the confident bearing of someone born to command. Geoffrey met him in the courtyard, and Thomas saw them talking, saw the steward gesturing, explaining. Even from a distance, he could see Sir Edmund's expression darken as he learned what had happened in his absence. After a few minutes, the Lord dismounted and strode into the keep, Geoffrey hurrying to keep pace. Thomas knew he would be summoned eventually, and sure enough, a servant appeared an hour later to bring him to the great hall. Sir Edmund was there with his senior household, still in his traveling clothes, mud-splattered and road-weary. But his eyes were sharp as they fixed on Thomas. "You're the carpenter who worked on the garderobe where the girl died." It wasn't a question, but Thomas answered anyway. "Yes, my lord." "Explain to me what happened. Why did the structure fail?" Thomas explained as he had explained to Geoffrey, to the council, to anyone who asked. The deteriorating stonework, the crumbling mortar, the wooden framework that hadn't been enough to hold when the stones shifted. He didn't try to shift blame or make excuses, just stated the facts as clearly as he could. Sir Edmund listened in silence, his face unreadable. When Thomas finished, the Lord turned to Geoffrey. "And you knew the structure was compromised. Yet you refused to authorize proper repairs." Geoffrey's face went even paler than usual. "My lord, the repairs could have waited until spring. The framework the carpenter installed should have been sufficient." "Should have been." Sir Edmund's voice was cold. "A girl is dead, Geoffrey. Her father is one of my tenants, a good man who has served this estate faithfully for 20 years. His daughter came to work in my castle, under my protection, and died because we were too cheap or too lazy to maintain our own facilities properly." There was a long, uncomfortable silence. "Show me the list of repairs," Sir Edmund said finally. "All of them. Everything that needs to be done." They spent the rest of the afternoon going through the catalog that Thomas and Robert had compiled. Sir Edmund examined each item, asked detailed questions about the nature of the problems and the proposed solutions, occasionally climbing the stairs himself to inspect particularly serious cases. He was thorough and surprisingly knowledgeable about building and maintenance, asking the kinds of questions that showed real understanding. As evening approached, they returned to the great hall. Sir Edmund sat in his chair and looked at the assembled household officials. "We will do the repairs," he said. "All of them. Not in spring now. I don't care if it's the middle of winter. I don't care if it's expensive or inconvenient. We will make this castle safe for the people who live and work here, because that is our duty and our responsibility." Hugh the Chamberlain started to speak, probably to object to the cost, but Sir Edmund cut him off with a look. "I will not have another death on my conscience, because we were too miserly to maintain our own home. The repairs begin immediately. Geoffrey, you will oversee the work. Thomas, Robert, you will direct the actual repairs and have whatever men and materials you need. Is that clear?" They all nodded. Thomas felt something ease in his chest, a tension he hadn't fully realized he was carrying. This wouldn't bring Alice back, wouldn't undo what had happened, but at least something good might come from the tragedy. Sir Edmund dismissed them, but as Thomas was leaving, the Lord called him back. "A word, Carpenter." Thomas returned, wondering if he was about to be dismissed, blamed for the accident despite the Lord's earlier words. But Sir Edmund's expression was not angry. "Geoffrey tells me you tried to get authorization for proper repairs before the accident. That you warned the structure needed more than just surface work." "Yes, my lord. Though I should have been more insistent." "I should have." "You should have nothing." Sir Edmund's voice was firm. "You did your job. You identified the problem, you reported it, you did what you could with the resources you were given. The failure was not yours, it was mine, for not ensuring proper maintenance procedures were in place. It was Geoffrey's, for prioritizing convenience over safety. But it was not yours." Thomas didn't know what to say to that. He managed a nod. "I'm told you do excellent work," Sir Edmund continued. "The chapel screen you're carving, for instance. I saw it briefly when I came through. It's beautiful work, the kind that will last generations." "Thank you, my lord. But beauty means nothing if the basic structures fail. A castle can have the finest carvings and the richest tapestries, but if the walls are crumbling and the floors are unsafe, what good is any of it?" He paused, seeming to consider his next words carefully. "I want you to take charge of all carpentry work related to these repairs. Not just the guardrobes, everything. Inspect the entire castle. Find every weakness, every failing structure, every place where age or neglect has created a danger. Report directly to me, not to Geoffrey. I want complete honesty about what needs to be done." It was a massive responsibility, far beyond Thomas's usual duties. It was also a remarkable show of trust from a lord to a tradesman. "My lord, I'm honored, but I'm not sure I have the experience." "You have the honesty, which is more important. And you have the skill. The rest you'll learn." Sir Edmund stood, signaling the conversation was over. "Oh, and Thomas. Alice's father, John is his name. I want you to meet with him. Explain what happened, what we're doing to prevent it from happening again. It won't ease his grief, but he deserves to know the truth." That evening, Thomas walked through the village to John's farmstead with leaden steps. The sun had set, and the stars were emerging in a clear, cold sky. His breath plumed white in the air, and ice crunched beneath his boots. He carried with him a purse of silver, Sir Edmund's compensation to Alice's father, 20 shillings that could never replace a daughter, but might at least ease the family's immediate financial burden. He also carried the weight of words he didn't know how to say. The farmstead was modest but well kept, a sign of a man who took pride in his work. Smoke rose from the chimney, and light glowed through the gaps around the shuttered windows. Thomas stood at the door for a long moment, gathering his courage before he finally knocked. John opened the door himself. He was a big man, broad-shouldered from years of farm work, with hands like oak roots. His face was drawn with grief, his eyes red-rimmed. When he saw Thomas, his expression didn't change. There was no anger there, but no welcome either. Just a terrible, hollow emptiness. "Master John," Thomas began, his voice rough. "I'm Thomas, the carpenter. I worked on the garderobe where your daughter, where Alice fell. Sir Edmund sent me to speak with you." For a moment, John just stared at him, and Thomas thought he might close the door in his face. But then the farmer stepped back, gesturing for him to enter. The interior of the house was warm and clean. A woman, Alice's mother, Thomas assumed, sat by the fire, her hands busy with some mending, though her eyes were distant, unfocused. 2 younger children, a boy and a girl, sat at the table, their faces solemn beyond their years. The family was in mourning, and Thomas felt like an intruder, bringing his explanations and his silver into the midst of their grief. "Speak then," John said, not sitting, not offering Thomas a seat. So Thomas spoke. He explained what had happened as clearly and honestly as he could. He described the deteriorating stonework, the repairs he had attempted, the way the structure had failed. He didn't make excuses or try to shift blame. He simply told the truth, that he had done his best, but his best hadn't been good enough, and Alice had paid the price for that failure. "I'm sorry," he said when he was done. "I know that doesn't change anything, doesn't bring her back. But I am deeply, truly sorry. If I could trade places with her, if I could undo what happened, I would do it without hesitation." John was silent for a long time, his jaw working. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. "She was my firstborn. Did you know that, my Alice? She was born on a spring morning with the birds singing and the sun shining, and when I held her for the first time, I thought she was the most perfect thing I'd ever seen." He paused, struggling for control. "She wanted to work at the castle. Thought it would be a better life than farming. We tried to talk her out of it, her mother and I, but she was stubborn. Always stubborn. She didn't deserve what happened to her," Thomas said quietly. "No one does." "No," John's voice broke on the word. "No, she didn't." Thomas held out the purse. "This is from Sir Edmund. Compensation for your loss. And he wanted me to tell you that repairs are being made throughout the castle. Every garderobe, every structure that might be unsafe. What happened to Alice will never happen to anyone else." John took the purse mechanically, weighing it in his hand without looking at it. 20 shillings, he said flatly. "That's what my daughter's life is worth. 20 shillings. No, Thomas said, and his voice came out fiercer than he intended. No, her life is worth more than all the silver in England. But we can't bring her back, and this is all we can offer. It's not enough, it will never be enough, but it's what we have. Something in John's face shifted, some of the terrible blankness giving way to raw pain. She was 16 years old. 16. She should have had a whole life ahead of her. Marriage, children, growing old. She should have buried me, not the other way around. I know. Thomas felt his own eyes burning. I have children of my own. I can't imagine. I don't know how you bear it. I don't know either, John said, and suddenly he seemed to collapse inward, the strength going out of him. He sank down onto a bench, his head in his hands. I don't know how I'm supposed to get up tomorrow and plow the fields and feed the animals and pretend that the world hasn't ended. I don't know how to do that. His wife came to him then, putting her hand on his shoulder, and he reached up to clasp it. They stayed like that for a moment, bound together in their shared grief. Thomas felt like he was intruding on something too private for outsiders, but he couldn't leave, not yet. If there's anything I can do, he said helplessly. Anything at all. I know it doesn't change what happened, but if there's any way I can help. You can make sure it never happens again, John said without looking up. That's what you can do. Make sure no other father has to stand over his child's grave and wonder why. Make sure the work is done right, whatever it takes. I will, Thomas promised. I swear it. He left the farmstead shortly after, walking back through the frozen darkness with his heart heavy. The stars wheeled overhead, cold and distant and uncaring. The world went on, indifferent to human suffering, and somehow people had to find a way to go on with it. When he reached home, Alina was still awake, waiting for him. He told her about the meeting, about John's grief and the terrible weight of it. She held him while he cried for the first time since Alice's death, tears he hadn't let himself shed until now. "You're a good man," she said when he was done. "A good man carrying a burden that isn't entirely his to carry. But I know you won't put it down, will you?" "I can't," he said simply. "Not until I know I've done everything possible to make things right." The next morning, Thomas began the work that would consume the rest of the winter. He and his expanded crew, Will, Robert, and Peter the masons, and 4 laborers that Sir Edmund assigned to them, started a systematic inspection of every structure in the castle. Not just the guardrobes now, but everything. Stairs, floors, doors, shutters, roof timbers, anything that might pose a danger if it failed. They worked from dawn until dark, moving through the castle room by room, making notes, marking problems, prioritizing repairs. It was exhausting work, physically and mentally demanding, but Thomas drove himself relentlessly. Every time he felt tired, every time he wanted to take a shortcut or accept a merely adequate solution, he thought of Alice and forced himself to be more thorough. They found problems everywhere. A staircase in the north tower where the steps had worn so thin they were near to cracking. A section of floor in the servants' quarters where water damage had rotted the joists beneath. A door frame in the armory that had shifted, creating a gap large enough for winter wind to howl through. The list grew longer every day, a catalog of neglect and aging that was overwhelming in its scope. But they also began making repairs. The most urgent problems were addressed immediately. The staircase was reinforced, the rotted joists replaced, the door frame reset. The garderobes received special attention. Working with Robert and Peter, Thomas developed a system for inspecting and repairing the shafts. They built scaffolding that could be lowered down into the openings, allowing the masons to work on the stonework from inside. It was dangerous, claustrophobic work, and more than once Thomas had to overcome his own fear of the dark, narrow spaces to inspect what was being done. The cold made everything harder. Mortar had to be mixed carefully and protected from freezing before it could set. Workers' hands grew numb even through gloves, making fine work difficult. The days were short, the light failing early, so they worked by lamplight when they had to, casting strange shadows on the stone walls. As they worked, Thomas came to understand the castle in a new way. He had lived within its walls for years, had worked on countless projects throughout its rooms and corridors, but he had never truly comprehended it as a complete structure, a living thing that aged and changed and required constant care. The castle was like a body, he realized. It needed maintenance the way a body needed food and rest. Neglect it and it would sicken and fail. Care for it properly and it would serve for generations. He shared this insight with Sir Edmund during one of their regular meetings. The Lord had proven true to his word about wanting regular reports, and Thomas found himself sitting with him every few days to discuss progress and problems. A body, Sir Edmund repeated, considering the metaphor. I like that. And like a body, small problems become large ones if left untended. Exactly, my lord. A cracked stone seems like nothing, but water gets into the crack, freezes, expands, and suddenly you have a gap in the wall. A loose board seems minor, but someone catches their foot on it and falls down the stairs. And by the time we notice the large problems, they've become crises. Sir Edmund nodded slowly. We need a different approach to maintenance. Not waiting for things to break and then scrambling to fix them, but regular inspection and repair before problems become dangerous. That would require resources, my lord. Men dedicated to the work, materials kept in store, a system for tracking what needs attention. Then we'll create that system. Sir Edmund was decisive. When this immediate crisis is past, I want you to work with Geoffrey to develop a proper maintenance schedule. Every structure in the castle inspected at regular intervals, repairs made promptly, records kept. You'll oversee the carpentry work. Robert can oversee the masonry. We'll make this castle safe and keep it that way. It was an ambitious vision, and Thomas felt both honored and daunted by it. He was just a carpenter, not an administrator or a planner. But Sir Edmund seemed to have faith in him, and he was determined not to betray that trust. The winter deepened. The days after Christmas were the coldest Thomas could remember, with temperatures so low that water left standing overnight froze solid. The castle's wells had to be carefully tended to prevent them from icing over. The moat was a sheet of ice thick enough to walk on, which was both useful. It made accessing the base of the guardrobes easier, and worrying, given that it meant the drainage system couldn't function properly. Despite the cold, the work continued. Thomas and his crew became fixtures throughout the castle, always visible somewhere with their tools and materials, always making noise with their hammering and sawing. The household grew used to them, learned to work around the disruptions they caused. Some people complained about the inconvenience, but most seemed to understand that the work was necessary, especially after what had happened to Alice. Thomas saw Alice's father once more during that winter, at the village church on a Sunday. John was there with his family, and Thomas noticed how the man seemed to have aged years in a matter of weeks. His shoulders were more bowed, his movements slower. But when their eyes met across the church, John gave Thomas a small nod, not forgiveness exactly, but perhaps acknowledgement, perhaps acceptance that Thomas was doing what he could. It was more than Thomas felt he deserved, but he held on to it anyway. Margaret turned 13 that winter, and Thomas was struck by how much she had grown. She was no longer a child, but becoming a young woman, thoughtful and capable. She had been helping Eleanor more with the household work, but Thomas noticed she often watched him as he worked, asking questions about what he was doing and why. One evening, she approached him directly. "Father, could you teach me properly? Not just the simple sanding and such, but real carpentry." Thomas looked up from the hinge he was repairing, surprised. "It's not common for girls to learn trades like this, Margaret." "I know. But I'm good at it, aren't I? You've said so yourself. And there's nothing I'd rather do." Her dark eyes were serious, earnest. "I don't want to just marry and keep house. I want to make things that matter, that last." Thomas thought about it, about the difficulties she would face as a woman trying to enter a male-dominated trade, about the scorn and resistance she would encounter. But he also thought about her skill and her genuine interest, about the way her face lit up when she mastered a new technique. "All right," he said finally. "I'll teach you properly. But you have to understand it won't be easy. People will mock you, will say you're trying to be something you're not meant to be. You'll have to work twice as hard as any boy to prove yourself." "I don't care," Margaret said firmly. "I want to learn." So she became his second apprentice, working alongside Will when her other duties allowed. Will, to his credit, didn't seem to mind having a girl working beside him. If anything, he seemed to appreciate having someone to talk to who understood the work. And Margaret proved herself quickly, her careful attention to detail and her willingness to listen making her a natural student. Eleanor had mixed feelings about it. "I worry for her," she confided to Thomas one night. "The world isn't kind to women who step outside their expected roles." "I know," Thomas said. "But would you have her deny who she is, what she's capable of, just to fit expectations?" "No," Eleanor admitted. "No, I suppose I wouldn't. I just wish the world were different." "So do I." By mid-February, they had completed repairs on all 17 of the most seriously deteriorating garderobes. Each one had been thoroughly inspected, the stonework repaired or replaced where necessary, new wooden seats installed, and the drainage systems improved. Thomas had also developed a maintenance schedule for them, monthly inspections, with any problems noted and addressed immediately. But the work was far from finished. There were still dozens of other repairs to be made throughout the castle, problems they had identified but not yet addressed. The list was daunting, but Thomas worked through it methodically, prioritizing by safety and urgency. One task that weighed on him particularly was returning to the East Tower garderobe where Alice had died. It had been sealed since the accident, the damaged shaft temporarily boarded over, but now it needed proper repair. Thomas had been putting it off, dreading the return to that place, but it couldn't be avoided forever. He waited for a day when Alina could come with him. He didn't explain why he wanted her there, but she seemed to understand. She left the children with her father and accompanied Thomas to the tower, climbing the narrow stairs in silence. The corridor still bore marks from the accident, stains on the floor that hadn't quite washed away, scratches in the stone where debris had fallen. Thomas pushed open the door to the garderobe and they stepped inside. Someone had cleaned it as well as they could, but the space still felt haunted. The enlarged hole in the floor was covered by boards, but Thomas could see the edges of the broken stonework around it, the violence of the collapse still evident. "This is where she died," Alina said quietly. It wasn't a question. This is where she fell. She died at the bottom. Thomas knelt beside the covered opening, running his hands over the boards. "I keep thinking about those last moments. The seat giving way beneath her, the fall through the darkness, the impact. Did she have time to be afraid? Did she know what was happening? Does it help to torture yourself with those questions?" "No. But I can't stop." He looked up at her. "I need to repair this one myself, Alina. Not delegate it to someone else. I need to be the one to make it safe again." She knelt beside him, taking his hands. "Then we'll do it together. I'll help you however I can." They spent the next 3 days working on that garderobe. Thomas removed the temporary boards and inspected the damage carefully, measuring and planning. The shaft needed to be completely rebuilt. There was no salvaging what remained. With Robert's help, he had a new shaft constructed, the stonework solid and properly mortared, the drainage improved to prevent future ice buildup. He built a new wooden seat from the finest oak he had, spending extra time on the joints and finish, making it as perfect as he could. It was more than the job required. It was, in its way, a memorial to Alice, though he never said so aloud. It was his way of honoring her memory, of trying to create something good from something terrible. When the work was finally done, Thomas stood back and examined it critically. The garderobe looked like new, better than new actually, since the original had been built quickly, and without the care this one had received. It was safe, it was solid. It would last. But Alice was still dead, and no amount of perfect carpentry could change that. As winter slowly began its retreat, the days growing imperceptibly longer, the worst of the cold starting to ease, Thomas found himself reflecting on what the past months had taught him. He had learned about the hidden structures that made civilized life possible, the unglamorous necessities that no one wanted to think about but that everyone needed. He had learned about the consequences of neglect, about how small decisions and compromises could accumulate into tragedy. But he had also learned about resilience, about how people carried on even after terrible losses. John still farmed his fields, still cared for his remaining children, still got up each morning even though his world had been shattered. The castle household still functioned, still maintained its routines, still found moments of joy and laughter despite the shadow of Alice's death. Life went on, it had to. That was perhaps the most important lesson of all. One evening in early March, as the first hints of spring were appearing, a slight warmth in the sun, the occasional bird call that wasn't just crows, Thomas sat with his family around their table. Catherine was chattering about a butterfly she'd seen, the first of the season. John was arguing with Margaret about something, their voices rising and falling in familiar sibling discord. Eleanor was smiling at them all, a small private smile that spoke of contentment despite hardship. Thomas looked at them and felt a surge of fierce protectiveness. This was what mattered. Not the castle's glory or the Lord's ambitions, or even his own pride in his work. Just this, the people he loved, safe and warm and together. Everything else was in service to this. "Father," Catherine said, tugging on his sleeve. "Tell us a story." She loved stories, always had. Thomas usually told her tales from the lives of the saints, or simple fables about animals. But tonight, watching her eager young face in the firelight, he found himself thinking about a different kind of story. "Let me tell you about a castle," he began. A castle that seemed strong and solid, but that was slowly crumbling from within. He told them about the winter, though he simplified it for Catherine's sake, turning it into a tale about brave workers who fought against time and cold to keep people safe. He told them about discovering hidden problems and fixing them, about the importance of maintaining the structures that protected them. He didn't tell them about Alice. That story was too raw, too painful. That story was for later, when they were older and could understand the weight of it. When he finished, Margaret said thoughtfully, "So the moral is that you have to take care of things properly, even the parts no one sees." "Especially the parts no one sees," Thomas agreed. "Those are often the most important." That night, lying beside Eleanor in the darkness, Thomas felt something he hadn't felt in months, a sense of peace, or if not quite peace, at least acceptance. He couldn't change what had happened. He couldn't bring Alice back or erase John's grief, or undo his own mistakes. But he could learn from it. He could be more careful, more thorough, more insistent on doing things right even when it was inconvenient or expensive. He could be better. "What are you thinking about?" Eleanor asked softly. About the future, he said. About the maintenance system Sir Edmund wants to establish. About teaching Margaret properly. About all the work still to be done. He paused. About how strange it is that something as mundane as a privy can teach you so much about life. Eleanor laughed quietly. Only you would find philosophy in a garderobe. Someone has to. He pulled her closer. The world needs people who pay attention to the unglamorous necessities, who make sure the hidden structures are sound. Otherwise, everything falls apart. The hidden structures, Eleanor repeated. I like that. It's not just about castles, is it? No. It's about everything. Families, community, society itself. All of it depends on hidden structures that no one thinks about until they fail. They lay together in comfortable silence, listening to the night sounds of the castle around them. Somewhere a dog barked, somewhere a door creaked shut. The sounds of life continuing, of the mundane miracle of daily existence. Thomas woke the next morning to find that spring had truly begun its arrival. Weak sunlight filtered through the shutters, and when he stepped outside, the air carried a hint of warmth that hadn't been there the day before. The ice on the eaves was dripping, creating a rhythmic percussion that spoke of thaw and renewal. He made his way to his workshop as usual, but his step felt lighter somehow. The weight he'd been carrying hadn't disappeared. He knew it never truly would, but it had shifted, become something he could live with rather than something that crushed him. Sir Edmund summoned him that afternoon, and Thomas found the Lord in his private chamber, reviewing accounts with Hugh the Chamberlain. Sir Edmund looked up as Thomas entered and dismissed Hugh with a gesture. I've been reviewing the work completed this winter, the Lord said without preamble. It's impressive, Thomas. Not just the volume of it, but the thoroughness. Geoffrey tells me you've created a comprehensive system for ongoing maintenance. With Robert's help, my lord. And your support made it possible. Nevertheless, Sir Edmund stood and walked to the window, looking out over the castle courtyard. I've been thinking about what happened, about Alice, and about what it revealed. This castle, any great structure, is only as strong as its weakest element. We can have mighty walls and skilled warriors, but if the basic infrastructure fails, none of it matters. Yes, my lord. I'm creating a new position. Master of Works, I'm calling it. Someone responsible for overseeing all maintenance and repairs throughout the castle and the estate. Someone who reports directly to me, who has the authority to identify problems and authorize repairs without waiting for a crisis. He turned to face Thomas. I want you to take the position. Thomas stared at him, stunned. My lord, I'm just a carpenter. I don't have the experience to. You have exactly the experience needed. You understand how structures work and how they fail. More importantly, you understand that prevention is better than repair, and repair is better than tragedy. You learned that lesson in the hardest way possible, and I trust you won't forget it. But the chapel's screen, the carving work, will be there when you have time for it. or you can train someone else to do it. Beauty and artistry are valuable, Thomas, but they're luxuries. Safety is a necessity. Sir Edmund's expression softened slightly. I'm not asking you to give up your craft entirely, but I am asking you to make this your primary responsibility. The castle needs someone who will care about the hidden structures, as your wife so aptly put it. Thomas felt the weight of the offer, the responsibility and the honor of it. He thought about Alice, about John's grief, about all the small failures that could cascade into catastrophe if no one paid attention. He thought about Margaret learning the trade, about Will's steady reliability, about the satisfaction of making things safe. I accept, he said quietly, on one condition. Sir Edmund raised an eyebrow. You're in no position to make conditions, Carpenter. Nevertheless, my lord, I want a memorial for Alice. Nothing grand, just a small marker in the castle chapel acknowledging her death and what it taught us, so that no one forgets why this work matters. The Lord considered this for a long moment, then nodded. Agreed. You'll design it yourself, I assume. Yes, my lord. Something simple but enduring. Like all your best work. Sir Edmund extended his hand, and after a moment's hesitation, Thomas took it. It was an unusual gesture. Lords didn't typically shake hands with tradesmen. But then again, this was an unusual situation. Thomas left the chamber with his mind spinning, master of works. It was a position of genuine responsibility, of trust and authority. It would change everything about his life and work. But as he thought about it, he realized it felt right. This was what he was meant to do, not just create beautiful things, but maintain the structures that kept people safe. He went home to tell Eleanor and found her in the kitchen with Margaret, teaching their daughter to make bread. They looked up as he entered, and something in his face must have told them he had news. What's happened? Eleanor asked. He told them about Sir Edmund's offer, about the new position and what it would mean. When he finished, there was a moment of silence. Then Margaret said, "So you'll be teaching me not just carpentry, but maintenance and inspection as well. If you want to learn it." "I do." Her expression was serious, determined. "Someone needs to carry on the work after you. Why shouldn't it be me?" Thomas looked at Eleanor, who shrugged with a small smile. "She's your daughter. Stubborn and idealistic, just like her father. I'm not sure whether to be insulted or complimented by that." "Both," Eleanor said firmly. "Always both." That evening, Thomas began sketching designs for Alice's memorial. He wanted something that captured not just her death but the lesson it taught, the importance of attending to the unglamorous necessities that made life possible. After several attempts, he settled on a simple design, a stone panel carved with an image of hands building a wall with an inscription beneath. Not Alice's name. John would want a proper gravestone for that, but words that would remind everyone who saw it why the work mattered. He showed the design to Sir Edmund the next day, and the Lord approved it immediately. "Commission it from Robert," Sir Edmund said. and place it where people will see it regularly, in the main corridor perhaps, where the household passes daily. Over the following weeks, as winter finally released its grip and spring truly arrived, Thomas began his new role. He created schedules for inspections, trained others in what to look for, established procedures for reporting and addressing problems. It was administrative work as much as physical labor, and sometimes he missed the simple satisfaction of working with wood. But there was a different kind of satisfaction in knowing that the systems he was building would prevent future tragedies. Robert completed Alice's memorial in early April. It was beautiful work. The hands building the wall were detailed and realistic, and the inscription was clearly carved in elegant letters, in memory of those who maintain the hidden structures that keep us safe. May we never forget that every stone matters, every board counts, and every life is precious. They installed it on a bright spring day, with Sir Edmund and the household gathered to witness. John came from the village with his family, and when he saw the memorial, his eyes filled with tears. He traced the carved hands with his own work-roughened fingers and nodded slowly. "Thank you," he said to Thomas. This helps. Knowing that she's remembered, that what happened meant something." "She'll always be remembered," Thomas said. "I'll make sure of that." As spring deepened into summer, life at Thornwick found a new rhythm. The garderobes functioned properly, the castle's structures were maintained, and the systems Thomas had established were working. There were still problems, of course. There always would be, but now they were caught early and addressed before they could become dangerous. Thomas still carved, still created beautiful things when time allowed. He finished the chapel screen, and it was indeed as magnificent as he'd hoped. But he took more pride in the maintenance logs he kept, in the schedules he'd created, in the small repairs that no one noticed because they prevented problems rather than responding to them. Margaret continued her apprenticeship, learning not just carpentry but the broader skills of maintaining a castle's infrastructure. Will proved reliable and capable, and Thomas began to trust him with more complex work. Together, the three of them formed the core of what would become Thornwick's permanent maintenance staff. Eleanor watched it all with quiet satisfaction. "You found your calling," she told Thomas one evening. "Not just making things, but taking care of them. Keeping people safe." "Someone has to," he said. "And I learned the hard way what happens when no one does." Years would pass. Thomas would grow older, would train more apprentices, would see his children grown and have grandchildren of their own. Margaret would indeed become a skilled carpenter, one of the few women to achieve that status, and would eventually succeed her father as master of works. The systems Thomas created would be refined and improved, would spread to other castles as other lords heard of Thornwick's approach to maintenance. But he never forgot that winter, never forgot Alice or the lesson her death had taught him. Every time he inspected a garderobe, every time he examined a beam or tested a stone, he remembered. And he made sure that everyone who worked under him remembered too, because in the end, that was what mattered. Not the glory or the recognition, not even the beautiful things he'd created. What mattered was the hidden structures, the unglamorous necessities, the work that kept people safe. What mattered was learning from tragedy and making sure it never happened again. The garderobe in winter had indeed held a deadly secret, that neglect and expedience could kill as surely as any sword. But from that tragedy had come wisdom, and from wisdom had come change. The castle's privies were now the best maintained in England, a fact that would have seemed absurd if it weren't so deadly serious. Thomas would tell this story to his grandchildren years later when they asked about his work. He would tell them about Alice, about the collapse, about the lesson learned at such terrible cost. And he would tell them the most important part, that every structure, no matter how humble or hidden, mattered, that the work of maintenance and care was as noble as any other, that preventing tragedy was better than responding to it. Remember, he would say to them, as twilight gathered and the fire burned low, remember that civilization rests on hidden structures, on the work of people who pay attention to things others ignore, on those who understand that every stone matters, every board counts, and every life is precious. And in the chapel at Thornwick, Alice's memorial would stand for centuries, a reminder carved in stone of a winter's deadly lesson and the carpenter who learned it. A reminder that even in the darkest tragedies, there could be meaning, if only we were wise enough to see it and brave enough to act on it. The castle endures. The systems hold. The work continues. And somewhere, perhaps, a young girl's spirit rests easier, knowing that her death meant something, that others were saved because of what was learned from her loss. This is how we honor the dead, not just with words or monuments, but with action. Not just with memory, but with change. Not just with grief, but with determination that their suffering will not be meaningless. Thomas understood this in the end, and in understanding it, he found a measure of peace and a purpose that would sustain him through all the years to come. The winter passed, spring returned. Life continued, and the hidden structures held firm, maintained by careful hands and mindful hearts, keeping safe all those who sheltered within Thornwick's ancient walls. May we all learn, as Thomas did, that the work we do matters, even when no one sees it, even when it's unglamorous, even when it's difficult. May we remember that prevention is better than tragedy, that care is better than neglect, and that every life is precious beyond measure. Rest now, dear traveler, with this story to keep you company through the night. Rest knowing that somewhere, someone is paying attention to the hidden structures that keep us all safe. Rest in the knowledge that even in darkness, there can be light, and even in tragedy, there can be meaning. Sleep well.